Hi everyone, welcome to episode 53 of the Startup Playbook podcast. My name is Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they use to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. Just a quick message from me before we get into this episode. On Monday, the 3rd of July, I will be doing a live podcast event with Vicky Lay, who is the managing director at Artesian Venture Partners. Prior to her role with Artesian, she was the co-founder and chief operations officer at Zookle, a local startup which raised funding from Silicon Valley investors and generated $20 million in revenue last year. If you're in Melbourne on the 3rd of July, I would love to see you there. You can register for the event by heading to tinyurl.com/playbookvicky. I'll also include the link in the show notes for this episode at startupplaybook.co. So for this episode, my guest is Pete Cooper. Pete has been one of the pillars in growing the Australian startup ecosystem, particularly in his hometown of Sydney. He's probably best known for founding the SydStart Conference, the first tech conference of its kind in the country, and he actively mentors, invests, and is helping to develop an ecosystem to provide the best chances for startups to succeed. In the episode, we talk about a range of topics, including his transition from a corporate career path to being heavily involved with startups, how to find mentors, how to build communities, and how to get started in the startup ecosystem. Without further ado, here is my interview with Pete Cooper. Hi Pete, welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast, and thanks for taking the time to be on the show today.
Great to be with you, mate. Really good.
Very, very excited to have you on. You were one of the first people that I kind of came across and kind of looked up to as a bit of a mentor when I first got into the space when I was back in Sydney all those years ago. But for those people that may not be as familiar with you or your background, do you want to tell them a little bit about your story and what you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, well, a lot of people just pigeonhole me as the SydStart guy because that was one of the first conferences, probably the first real one for startups. But I was just a normal geek, did computing science at UTS back in the day. I think we were the first actual graduating year from computer science in the days when funding was driven more about industry engagement than about undirected, hypothetical research. So I think it's interesting how times have changed, and we probably need to revisit some of the things that used to work on that industry engagement. And then from there went to CSR, sugar, bulk sugar distribution network around the country. That wasn't so exciting, old school industry, but the technology was, because it was then used by the stock exchange, and Compaq acquired it. But in the meantime, the ASX was one of the first in the world to introduce real-time trading systems, and then the following year we did the options market. So I built the trading control software that turned the market on and off for individual stocks and monitored the very inside of the in horrible old school languages. But it was pretty exciting, 87, it's a long time ago. And then from there, just pretty much never had to apply for a job ever again, because it just kept getting headhunted to Rothschild and to Macquarie Bank and Standard Chartered Bank. So increasingly global roles, all in technology, in finance. But I've loved that junction between business and technology and strategy. And even though you might have your hands on the keyboards, build a bit of software. We were the first with when Paul Keating introduced personal superannuation in Australia back in the mid-90s. And bashed it out in sort of 6 weeks, and I think that's now called a sprint. And that is quietly built up into a $10 billion funds management business. So I think one of the lessons for the tech startups community for me was that don't just make wealth for other people, make it for yourself. I got a bit tired about just making more money for more institutions, basically. Sure, learn on their time, but then go and build your own great thing.
Sure. And what did that transition look like for you personally when you were at those institutions or in sort of trading and sort of transitioned quite aggressively towards the startup space?
Yeah, that's a really good one. I think there's lots of little signs. When you're working with those great people that are doing 50 projects and they've still got their own side hobbies that they love. They're the ones that you've got to keep an eye out for, because that's when that's where the magic happens. That innovation at the intersection. They're working on a busy project and they keep getting tapped on the shoulder by their own day job people, from business or tech. But then, in their own time, they're still even more passionate about something else. Maybe it's family or environment or something that's maybe more enduring or values driven. And that's also when your career and your satisfaction just explodes if you can make that junction of innovation also align with where you personally want to go. And that's certainly what happened for me. We did a spin-off, which is a joint venture between 4 fund managers to create Investment Link, which is a fund management hub like Swift, not for payments but for funds management instructions. About 2 million Aussies on it, and about 5,000 financial planners, 17 fund managers. And it was really just 2 guys on a whiteboard working it out. And then we got all the commitment from the different fund managers. So that was on behalf of my day job. I look back on it now and I think, well, any startup, what's now called fintech, and Australia has got a natural, very strong place in the world, and that we're probably pretty consistently in the top 10 and climbing because of our good regulations and good history and good banking industry. Any startup could have built that hub, and probably they would have probably done it better because it was independent. So it's not just about disrupting the existing economy; it's also about building this new, more resilient global economy. More openly looking and not getting too bogged down in the rubbish that our politicians dream up in each individual jurisdiction. Airbnb didn't let one jurisdiction hold them back. Neither has Uber or Google, and that's really what we as an industry for tech startups need to do.
Fantastic. And you touched on this a little bit earlier as well, but so SydStart, which you started, was one of the first tech conferences in Australia, and now there are a lot of them. I just went to Sunrise yesterday, which was absolutely fantastic. But what was that sort of like at a stage where there wasn't much of an ecosystem or a community? It hadn't really been done, a sort of conference. Like, what was that process like for you, and why did SydStart at that time need to exist?
So I've been working in Australia. We started a division in Macquarie which we looked at 800 tech startup investments around the world, and did detailed due diligence on 200 and invested in 8. And we missed out on some classics like PayPal. We pitched that to the board probably 3 times and didn't quite get it across the line for various reasons. And other people did commit to PayPal early, and I think that it's a great example of why these big institutions can be challenged, because they just don't miss the opportunities right under their nose that they could be grabbing. So I did some stuff with Standard Chartered in Singapore, and went for 4 years, and a lot of international and regional travel there. And coming back to Australia in 2005 made me realise just how little progress had been since .com1, and it was mildly frustrating, and actually became quite a major source of annoyance for me that knowing what great things we'd produced as a nation over time and as a technology sector we'd slowed down, and we weren't hyper connected. We weren't doing peer learning, that shoulder to shoulder peer learning when the real magic happens. And around about this time, people like Elia Bazanis and Mick Levinskis and others were popping their heads up, and Silicon Beach was formed. And I think I was in the first sort of 25 or whatever in that group. And there were others definitely ahead of me in that virtual thing, and then the Friday beers or whatever we used to do it. And I think that was the grace, and then it sort of filtered out and became largely online. But that community still exists. But as you would know, what you did with Startup Victoria is amazing, and all kudos to you, man. It's fantastic. It's hard to build a great community, and there wasn't the density and the quality of connections. So around about 2009-10, when we had the first SydStarts, the people at ATPI were very, now Cicada, were very nice and gave us a room, and I didn't think 50 people would turn up, but 80 turned up, and I thought they wouldn't hang around, but the security guard literally kicked us out at the end of the day, because everyone was just so happy to find like-minded souls and find their tribe and whatever, and that led to, I think we pretty much ran it every 6 months or 12 months, depending on how much spare time, and it just became the hobby that ate my life. To the point where it's now called StartCon, and it's 3,500 people, and I had to sell it. It was just too big, underwriting $15,000 an hour at the Hilton for 3 floors is just a bit too much for one individual. So freelancer.com bought it, and I think they've done a great job for it. And in the old SydStart days, a festival formed around it called Startup Week, and that became that sort of ran its natural course, and a new festival's now formed around StartCon called Spark Festival, which has got a bigger, more structured environment and wider representation across verticals. Shout out to Maxine Sheron, who's the new festival director for that. So I think they're definitely wanting to do that nationally, and if you're in any other city in Australia or the region and you want to do that, I think it would be great to see both for StartCon and for Spark. So I didn't do it because of I don't get excited about running co-working spaces, and I don't get excited about how tiring mentoring is sometimes, although I do love when people succeed. I certainly don't love running events because it's hard work. So shout out to all those people that do organise it, like Nikki Savak with Sunrise has been incredible success, and I love the way some of the things that we did at SydStart worked. You've just scaled in ways that no one else could do, where you're doing this first-hand learning from real founders that have really done stuff, and it just resonates so well with the young talent. And kudos to Google for sponsoring those women entrepreneurs and attending that conference, and the students. That's how we're going to scale our industry and develop these big funnels really big funnels into the industry. I'm doing, I think, one of the first talks ever by tech startup industry to the Australian Career Guidance Counsellors Association later this year, and there's just no bridges from the new economy to the old in a lot of these main pathways. So the conference was just the start of that, and that's why we created the Start Society, so that we can have that sort of SydStart feeling 365 days a year.
Yeah.
And that became a physical place called iCentral down in Sussex Street, and we're trying to do another one at the moment up at St Leonard's for a couple of hundred founders on the train station. So.
Sure. Yeah, I want to come back to iCentral and what you're doing at the moment with Start Society, but just jumping back, I know that SydStart at that time for you was pretty all-consuming, as a conference of that size is, when you've got one person who's kind of leading the charge with that. And you essentially running that for 4 to 5 years, and as you mentioned, you sort of exited out to freelance. Was that a difficult decision for you? Or
it was like selling your own child. It was horrible. And I think it felt the same to the 20 or so core volunteers that really helped there. And you know who you are. I could list so many people, but you know that the new owner's never going to do things the way you would do it, and we lost a bit of history there that was all on the web with photos and videos in that transition. But hopefully that'll be dug up at some point and put on YouTube and become part of the history of the industry. And I think didn't you pitch your?
I did.
Fashion
stage label,
a fashion launch platform, right?
Yeah,
150 labels.
Yeah,
it's fantastic. And there's lots of these great stories, and you can tell when people remember those moments that they first, showed their startup baby to the world on stage, and got caring but tough love feedback from the judges and the crowd, and that's now become a commonplace thing. But it wasn't a commonplace thing; it was so rare. And when we did the first ones at the Stock Exchange in the lead-up series to the SydStart, it had never been done before. The ASX didn't talk to startups. There is this sort of pattern that I'm trying to follow, which is just keep looking for the gaps. Don't just duplicate something because someone else has done something cool. Look for the gaps. What isn't being done. So we're looking at setting up a Pan-Asia fund at the moment because there's so much money in super that's going to come into tech startups. Insane amounts of money, and there might be a property crash, but in the meantime, prop tech is going nuts and changing the industry. There's a property exchange going to pop up that's on blockchain and with mortgages, so you can trade it like shares. There's a few that that are launching in the next 6 weeks that are just going to revisit entire whole industries, and I'm kind of happy about it because our underperforming political class is going to get challenged, whether they like it or not.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've played such a big role in helping shape the Australian, definitely the Sydney sort of startup ecosystem. How have you seen things evolve over that time, and what would you like to see more of moving forward?
Yeah, well, I suppose one of the not so positive things at the moment is this collaboration, right? We've been getting a bit selfish, and I think we need to get back to the pay it forward and the openness, and what you're doing with the podcast is great. There are some standout people that are just doing wonderful things. So I think we should just remember that the total success of the industry depends on that. If you're not developing the next generation and you're not helping people learn, then we're just destined to repeat failures. And so that's probably if you had to graph the give back factor, I think it climbed for quite a while, and we had a good 5 years, but the last 2 to 3 years it's probably been on the trend down. On a more positive note, the growth in the industry is probably one of the reasons for that. So the core culture that we had with maybe the 1500 at the core has now, just exploded. Like there's more than 1500 just in fintech, and then there's the health tech, and then there's the cyber guys that don't come out in public very often, and then there's the fashion, and I did one of the first mentoring sessions with a lovely lady. Do you know? Monpurse founder Lana Hopkins.
Yeah, she's great.
She's fantastic, right? And so symbolic of the next generation, I think, because they're taking in a passion, an area they love. Like I said, no, I don't want to be a mentor because UTS did the introduction. I was like, I don't know fashion, but Lana was so convinced that there was a need for custom handbags on the internet, which ostensibly is not a technology topic. But like Jodie Fox before her and Jane Liu and others, there's been a steady stream of non-tech founders that identified an area of passion, and they've managed to show the leadership and the industry insight that the tech guys will follow them in. And it is still, unfortunately, largely guys, but that's changing. So I didn't just pick 3 women entrepreneurs by coincidence. I think we need to be showcasing them a lot more than what we are. So that's great. And I still think another great thing is we're still developing this deeper tech. Getting Michael Bierchuk to run the quantum lab at UCIT, making other progress in quantum at UNSW, the entrepreneurship stuff at UNSW. I'm a proud UTS alumni, and that whole precinct has gone nuts with what we did at Fishburners and what they're now doing with Hatchery and Sydney School of Entrepreneurship with Nick Kay, from bringing the Stockholm model here. And never before have that many institutions collaborated to fund the Sydney School of Entrepreneurship. ATP only had 4 stakeholders. I think SSE, we were talking earlier, has 10 or 12. So they're global talents, and they're coming here to a growing scene. Now, probably at the face value, the negative is that our global rankings have been slipping, right? And the Bjorn Lassie-Hammer originated this thing, the Startup Genome Compass rankings, and the last rankings alone, I think Shanghai and Beijing just jumped straight out of the top 20 into the top 10 over Sydney and Melbourne. And that's just a reality of life, right? They just didn't have coverage on how much was already going on in Asia. So on one hand, we should congratulate ourselves for all the assets and the progress, but we need to keep this mindful global perspective that we're not actually keeping up right now. Shenzhen went from non-existent in the startup world to probably number 1 in IoT in less than 5 years, and it's still barely talked about in Australia. You could count the number of high-profile active angel investors in Australia from China and India on 2 hands, and we're just not building enough bridges. So and then you know the regulatory side, I think there's a few positive, nice things, but they're underappreciated, like the ASIC sandbox and the plethora of innovation ministers and assistant ministers, and the cynicism at the far right and far left of politics about innovation. So you know, I'm not looking for the government to solve these issues, but just to put it in perspective, that one quantum room at USyd, it was probably double the 5-year budget for incubator support for the whole country.
Wow.
So, you know, and even then that funding was hard fought for and taken off the market 12 months after it was granted. And then questionably, you know, there's 4 grants recently done for $500,000 each, without a lot of transparency on it. So I'm not questioning. I think some of those investments are good. The one in Newcastle for slingshotters in particular will be. I think that'll pay it. It'll make a big difference. Newcastle and Wollongong are really at risk of becoming Australia's Rust Belts, and just like the US. So out of this decline is often where the Phoenix stuff happens. You know, because you have the necessity for innovation. So I'm quite optimistic about Newcastle as a tech startup hub. Shout out to the 1804 group up there, and the Cyro group, and I think one of the solar groups has just done a global deal, which will be announced in the next sort of 6 to 8 weeks as well. So there's so many good things which we need to celebrate more. Would be another theme. I'd love to see what you're doing with the podcast. Is fantastic. Not many people have stuck with it for 50 podcasts.
Thank you. So yeah, I mean, you know, when it comes to things like government regulations, unfortunately, that's not always under our control. But what is controllable is, you know, the actions that we can take. So, like as startup founders, what would you like the ecosystem of the community to do more of to help support what's already happening here?
Well, yeah. So first up, join a group, right? Don't try to do too much by yourself. Even though there are some great examples of solo founders in garages creating the first round of good stuff, that is less success. There's typically less successful pattern than the connected one. I'm not saying go crazy and waste your time networking at meetups, random meetups every 6 times a week. Just don't do that. Be discerning, but do join a quality, you know. Industry group, you know, whether it's the Fishburners community or the Stone and Chalk for FinTech, or Tyro, or where we are now, the FinTech Hub, or the Startup Vic. We've got the national group for the Start Society. There's the Google and Salesforce funded lobby group, Startup Oz, which we set up in March 2013, 50 of us, and I think that's not as representative as most people would like, but it's still there, and it's the you know, probably mistakenly a lot of the regulators still think that represents the industry, but it doesn't. They just don't have the voice of the grassroots. Start Society's got probably 400 members now, a bit over that, and national. The angel groups, you know, I was quite disappointed for a little while there about the Sydney Angels group because they were just moving too slow and they had too much old economy. But almost all the angel groups are getting a revitalisation. Some of it's availability of assets, some of it's just natural ageing and rebirth over time. Most of those groups are good. So joining a group would be one of the first major steps. And getting a mentor, like mentoring for first-time founders is usually not in the top 5. Consistently this data, like this again and again and again for at least 5 years of data. But then after they've had 1 or 2 failures or 1 or 2 genuine attempts, mentoring jumps into the top 5, often in the top 3. And if you carefully choose, you know, your mentors, and you realise it's got to be a two-way street, you'll probably end up making friends. You'll get to leverage their networks. You might get a bit of unnecessary, boring conversations, but you'll have a good laugh about it. And there's this other thing, is that you're bringing the old economy with you into the new economy. So mentoring I highly recommend. There's so many great institutions that we've imported from overseas, like Founder Institute, which is still effectively run here. Shout out to Ben Chong and all the guys that have been running that over the years. Dan Ringrose, and the Springboard Enterprise Group for women entrepreneurs. Australia was the first place outside of the US. Founder Institute, I think it's in 100 cities, and it's got 3 in Australia. Their output internationally is around about 4,000 per annum projected by the end of this decade. So that would be the equivalent of producing our entire ecosystem every year. So you can't ignore these networks, and obviously the big investor groups like the 500 startups and those sorts of groups, which is another reason why we're doing this COBAC group project name. I won't go into that yet, but 20 cities in Southeast Asia focus, just spotting deals. So when a founder says, "Hey, should I do the next Uber for cleaning, house cleaning?" We can say, "Yeah, there's 7 in the region at the moment, and your main competitors are this, and this is what worked, and this is what's worked, and this is what can could be an option." And then I suppose the other thing I'd suggest is just run experiments. So people keep forgetting that, the reason startups are disrupting is because they're discovering the new ways. And it's one thing to have a hypothesis for your business. It's another thing to just keep blindly following the square peg in the round hole and hitting it harder, right? You should be just intelligently catching, drop them into Trello, drop them in a spreadsheet, I don't care, put a post-it note on the wall, and prioritise it based on the ability to assess that idea. And maybe it's just because it's a cheap test or it's a fast test. Running experiments will help you learn more about your customer and it forces you to talk directly to customers. Taking a mortgage, digging down and paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to have an app developed is not doing a startup, right? That's just throwing money out the window. Do it smart. Use your lean canvas. Use mental blank, the assumption testing board.
Business model canvas. The Alex Ostermeyer stuff. There's some really well-proven things that was a black art less than a decade ago, and now it's definitely a science. And the sooner you get connected to a community and to a mentor, maybe an investor group, maybe an accelerator group or an incubator, those things just happen to you. You can't. They almost fall into your lap. So. Do that. as you said, there's really is no shortage of ways to spend your money if you're looking at doing that. And as you kind of touched on, mentors can often be that sort of sounding board of advice of kind of steering you in the right direction with those things. One of the things that I often see with people who recognise that they need sort of mentors in place is not knowing where to start to find someone or how to build those relationships or what a good sort of relationship, mentor-mentee relationship looks like. Do you have any advice on how sort of a first-time founder or someone new to the space can help can get started in finding those mentors or those people?
It's quite a personal journey, I think. There's some obvious things, like you want someone that's had some success. You don't just want someone talking about all the things not to do. Don't just listen to someone because they're wearing a suit or they've had a job in a corporate, because often the skills required to build a startup. There has been an over-commitment lately to this whole. It's in the interest of the government and a lot of bodies with a lot of money for corporates to learn from startups under the guise of mentoring programs and investment programs, accelerator programs, corporate venture capital. And in actual fact, most of the time it's the startups that are actually the originators of the innovation. And so there's some good things about the corporate and the mentor startup relationship, and that is that you can help take it further faster. There's also some bad things in that you can get completely distracted and just approach things the wrong way. You assume you have to raise money when you could be bootstrapping. You assume that you're going to design a product and build it in a waterfall project management fashion rather than running experiments and iterating in a lean and agile way. And remembering they're just lots of methodologies. There's a lot more other methodologies that are equally valuable. I think finding the mentor, if you join those sort of Springboard Enterprises and the Founder Institutes, you'll find access to a lot, and you can very time efficiently meet a bunch of them and just like get to know you, and you'll start to form your own views on what you're looking for. Sometimes if you're an introvert, you might need that extrovert to help push you out, or if you're a quality focused person, you might need that sprinting salesperson, get things done, to complement your natural tendency to stay at home and work internally and produce a high quality product without knowing whether the customer's even going to look at it. So that could, deliberately seeking differences is a really healthy thing. The connectedness, obviously, and we've got such transparency on that now with LinkedIn and AngelList and so many services out there. I just can't underestimate the difference between old school mentors and new school mentors. So if they're not talking to you about some of these things, you're really missing out on the whole. If you're new to the tech startup scene, it's easy for you to just pick an old school mentor and say, oh yeah, they had a great fish and chip shop once, or they had a great engineering shop once, those you can still learn a lot from those people. But if you're not applying the new techniques, the likelihood is you'll end up just connecting to the old economy, and you'll apply the old techniques. So you will still get eaten when you get out to market. I met some guys up in Newcastle a while ago when we did the activation program there about 18 months ago, and they'd been exporting services to China for 20 years and never had their IP stolen because of the way they'd learnt to do it. In that was in mining. Industrial engineering and mining and in the wineries, the Hunter Valley up there. So so those skills are definitely transferable and useful. But if you talk to them about how they did product development, they were probably unintentionally, because they'd just been doing it for so long, actually running experiments, doing it in the lab. They just didn't know that it was called agile, and they didn't know about doing customer facing, product development and product market fit.
Yeah, so it's a little bit about kind of being self-aware of knowing what are your sort of weak points, or what is it that you potentially struggle with, where a mentor can come in and sort of guide you through those particular areas.
Yeah, they'll probably more likely to show you the blind spots.
Yeah.
Yeah, if they're open, and that's probably the last one I'll wrap up with. Ones that are brutally honest with you, like a friend would be.
Yeah. And again, we've kind of touched on this several times, and I think it's almost been a really big part of, from the outside looking in at your sort of everything that you've sort of touched over the last few years is the need to kind of build a community. And you kind of spoke on Silicon Beach. So Atula's done an amazing job. I don't know if you know Atula in Melbourne. He's done a fantastic job with the Melbourne Silicon Beach, and I think he's sort of expanding out to Tasmania as well, doing really well. I remember when I was in Sydney, the Silicon Beach drinks were just crazy. There were 40, 50 people at every single event. I've since heard that the community isn't as engaged as they once were. And obviously building a community is a really big part of any startup. So whether that's, especially on the consumer side of can you build an active community of people that are engaged with your product and are referring you and those sort of things. Can you talk a little bit about what a good community looks like, and how do you keep them engaged over time and sort of keep sticking with you?
Yeah, so I think it was easy to form a community in the early stages because there was just people crying out for any level of connectedness. So you get a salesperson talking to a developer just because they were both in tech, and then we went through a phase where it sort of validated a bit more. It wasn't just about the Subway franchisee, or the cash register salesperson. It was about am I building a global product that uses the internet? Because after all, that's what's transforming humanity, right? Internet and mobile, and then it matured a bit more in more recent years in the verticals. So you've got this. It's about finding the next need group, really, both for you individually and what the industry is going. So in health, there's been 3 major meetups on the East Coast developed, all of which are probably in the top 20 in the world, which is kind of weird. It shows what an early adopter society Australia is in some ways. And even cyber, which we've probably been quite behind on. We've had some deep historical stuff, and now the government's decided to focus on cyber security. It's going to come public. Property, which has become a love area. All these verticals, basically, fintech, obviously. And so finding the need is one of the enduring things. I think that there's a lot of incorrect assumptions about density being at a precinct level when you talk to architects or you talk to government people, or even the various levels of government. And the local governments are probably most guilty of this, is that there's an assumption that just if you put them within 3 or 4 blocks of each other, they'll talk. And that's not what happens, right? You need people to be in the same level of interest. Either a horizontal that cuts across verticals, like growth hacking, or database marketing, or responsive web app development, and also sitting shoulder to shoulder, doing that peer learning, working together, so you level up as a group. Micro communities of interest. It's pretty hard to do peer learning beyond 4 to 5 people in a deep specialisation. But then you meet face to face, and you can go away and still share and collaborate with a high level of trust online. Why Slack and HipChat have done so well, facilitating those sorts of things. So there's not as much trust on, say, Reddit or the other communities as there are in those tighter groups. So I think there's a lot more discerning perspective on community development now than there ever has been, which is a healthy thing. So I think one of the grassroots things is getting together, whether it's events or spaces, incubators, accelerators, co-working, and then forming those tight relationships around a narrow area. There's a TensorFlow group forming in the Start Society, which is all around machine learning, and there's 1 or 2 thought leaders there, but we're finding others day by day. Sports tech, we had that first sports tech meetup, whatever it was now, it was a long time ago, and people go, what's sports tech? It wasn't even a phrase. We were using the term travel tech, and someone had that name that they used for a business name. It's like, no, sorry, that's a generic term. There's a whole industry there. So there's phases of awareness as well, right? So Plato used to talk about this, and if you don't have an understanding of the stages of knowing, you need to learn that, because you can actually learn faster if you know what you don't know. If you know what I mean. If you realise that your level of awareness is lower, then you'll have a more humble approach to learning, and you're probably more likely to find it. Everyone's guilty of this. You think you know it, and then you realise that the whole game's moved on.
It's almost like the more you know, the more you realise that
what you don't know.
Yeah,
that's the winning position, I think, in my book. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so that kind of brings us back to some of the things that you're doing now. So again, for people that may not be as familiar with the Start Society, do you want to sort of explain a little bit about what the organisation does, and obviously the new sort of co-working space as well?
Yeah, so it's just a national body. We share. It's only grassroots. It's only for tech startups. Aiming for global product. Deliberately a little bit choosy, just because you'll have more in common when you're facing those challenges. You're less likely to get tied up in small jurisdictional issues, and you're more focused on what is the global proposition to humanity. And you can flex which country you're going to go to, and probably influence regulators through your success, right? So, there's some travel guys here in Tyro that are StartSoc members that are doing seat front, great way of buying tickets, multi-airline, cozy trip, multi-hotel, multi-jurisdiction, but starting in the big corridors from China. The idea is that if you're generally going for global and you're using the internet to do that, then you actually need to be world class. And how do you get world class when the university curriculums that are being delivered today were starting their design 3 years ago, and the graduates aren't going to come out for another 2 or 3 years? So pretty much when you graduate, a large percentage of your skills are 5 years out of date with what the global industry really needs. So basically there's an opportunity to you go to uni, learn basics, the stuff that's not changing, but the communities and the ecosystems around will help you compete globally, because they're constantly learning, and we want to crush that gap with the US and increasingly with China. It's not 2 years behind where we're just we're just peers. And the great role models, the Atlassians, the Canvas, those sorts of things are really making a difference for that Freelancer and Envato and those. Yeah.
Fantastic. And finally, in the 50th episode, I did follow-up interviews with Tom Ellis and Paul Naftali from at My Capital and Rampersad VC. And one of the things that they sort of mentioned was the need when we're looking globally, people don't look at us as Melbourne or Sydney or Adelaide or Brisbane startups. We're Australian startups, and the need for greater sort of collaboration as part of that. What's your sort of view on how do we sort of collaborate between everything that's kind of happening?
Yeah, so the Start Society is not trying to compete with any of the state groups like Startup Vic and Tech Sydney. In fact, we're very keen to keep that collaboration going. So we're probably, if anything, we're just trying to stay out of the individual politics and just keep focusing on the basics of what the members want. So why go and do a deal for Sydney or Victoria with Amazon? Just do a deal, right, and get $15,000 for every member, or maybe it's why go and find a lawyer in Brisbane when you can get a global lawyer like Squire, Patton Boggs, that we've just done a partnership with, and they're the number one company in Australia for taking it to San Francisco or taking it global, and vice versa. So we're just trying to cut through that noise, and also keep away from duplication of whatever's working. Just as Sunrise took that, the first half, every SydStart morning started with interviews and learning firsthand from entrepreneurs.
I remember that.
Sunrise took that, multiplied it, and has made it fantastic. And I think we're just quietly just going around and looking at where the gems are that aren't being picked up and trying to do it. So there's a VR group, and joining those societies will also keep your radar up on just how much innovation is going on in a less noisy way. There's a hell of a lot of the signal to noise ratio is as soon as you get away from that core of building a global tech startup, you get out into just general tech or IT or digital creatives and all that sort of stuff, and then you get out to mainstream stuff like just franchisee models and those sorts of things. There's all this talk about entrepreneurship, but it's not talking about globally successful product-based scalable businesses. And if you're not a marketplace with a standardised product experience in services, or if you're not a general standardised SaaS product or some other product that's repeatable and scalable, you're not building a global startup. You're just filling yourself. And so we need to keep that signal to noise ratio at the core of the industry, and the culture of giving back within the industry, and the culture of running experiments and acceptance of experiments may fail, and the culture of collaboration to get that milking stool of the hacker, the hipster and the hustler, the developer, the designer and the business person. There's a few basics that we just keep wandering away from and fall over, and then we come back and remember how that's why we're going global. That's why we're using a balance of skills. That's why we're giving back. That's why we get mentors. There's only about, if you do about those top 10 things, it's amazing how your risk reduces. And as I said earlier, there's an article on the website. There's $800 billion just from super. Before you look at the corporate venture capital and the family funds and the transatlantic money and the China money, there's $800 billion over the next decade or so coming in needs to come in, because technology is changing every industry vertical. So what used to be allocated to the vertical, is going to be allocated to the highest impact area, which is tech in that vertical. And our super pool in Australia is about 2.4 trillion, and it's ahead of schedule to get to 10 trillion by 2040. So if it's a balanced portfolio and you're putting 5 to 10% in tech today, and then you're looking forward, you want to be putting 10 to 20%, maybe 15 to 20% in tech, because it's affecting every industry. So 20% of 800 billion, 20% of 10 trillion would argue that there's $2 trillion. We couldn't absorb half of that. So our estimates are maybe there's 800 billion, and it's happening. Craig Winkler made a $5 million investment the other day. Airtree got a couple $100 million from super. Blackbird as well, Blue Sky. SoftBank just announced a $100 billion single fund. Ping An Insurance just announced $1 billion single fund, just in their narrow insurance team. So there's definitely a ridiculous amount of money coming. And my challenge to you listening to this podcast is build global startups, because the money probably won't be the problem. It'll be how good your work ethic is and how good your idea is, how many experiments you're running and how good your execution is.
Fantastic. On that note, Pete, thanks once again for being on the show. For anyone that wants to find out more, say hello, get in touch, what's the best way for them to do that?
Just go to thestartsociety.com or follow me on Twitter. It's PC and the number 0, the digit 0.
Perfect. I'll make sure those links are in the show notes. Pete, once again, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Rohit. Good on you. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to episode 53 of the Startup Playbook podcast. You can find the show notes of my interview with Pete, along with a curated list of tools and resources for startup founders at startupplaybook.co. As always, you can join the conversation through our Twitter account. The handle is @PlaybookStartup. Next week, I'll be interviewing Alfred Lowe, a corporate venture capitalist who, along with one of our former guests, Peter Huynh, co-founded and led Singtel Innovate's investment activities through Optus Innovate in Australia. Most recently, he was the head of AMP New Ventures, where he led AMP's local and international corporate venture capital program. In the interview, we will be talking about corporate innovation, the opportunities for collaboration between startups and corporates, and what investors look for in startups. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at episode 54 next week.